Welcome to the Engines of Texan, Episode 5, Comanche Superfood. I'm Brendan Seal. Gail Borden moved through the streets of Galveston, quote, in breathless haste, a man forever ahead of himself, end quote, according to one biographer. On this evening in particular, in 1847, he was loudly and excitedly inviting Galvestonians to an impromptu midnight dinner at his house, sweetening the invitation with the promise of some post-dinner entertainment. Being a devout Baptist, however, no one mistook Borden's invitation for anything too risque, but the 36-year-old Gail Borden was well-known enough and eccentric enough for people to be intrigued. Borden was basically the town's founding father, if you set aside the pirate Jean Lafitte, as the head of the land company that had surveyed and sold off most of the town's lots. But even before that, ever since his arrival in Texas in 1829, Gail Borden had always been one of the most widely known men in Anglo-Texas. Born in western New York in 1801 and raised along the Ohio River, at the age of 19 he had hired on to one of the first steamboats to ply the Ohio-Mississippi River, and he worked it all the way down to New Orleans and back. It was his first glimpse at the power of a literal engine of history, the steam engine, and the radical way in which it was revolutionizing the economics of transportation. Earlier watercraft had managed only maybe one round trip per year to New Orleans, but a steam-powered packet boat could make it 6 or 8 times. Not surprisingly, freight costs along the Mississippi soon fell from 5 cents a pound to 2 cents a pound. It was as though this great innovation had condensed the world. In this new world, distance was better measured in steamship days to New Orleans than in miles, an idea that must have impressed itself upon the young, analytically inclined Borden. Because Borden followed the big river south in the 1820s, taking on a job as a schoolteacher and then a land surveyor in lower Mississippi, which placed him solidly in Texas fever territory. In 1824, it infected his brother, who was among Stephen F. Austin's first 300. Gail didn't make it to Texas until 1829, but almost as soon as he did, Stephen F. Austin recognized his talent and made him his de facto colony land surveyor, which meant that Borden came to know pretty much every Anglo settler that came into East Texas during that time, which placed him in the inner circles of Anglo-Texas politics, where he'd be elected repeatedly to the increasingly revolution-minded conventions and committees on public safety, which gave him the idea to leverage this position in October of 1835 to start a newspaper, the Telegraph and Texas Register. And what a time it was to start a newspaper in Anglo-Texas. It was his paper that would warn Texans of Centralist units advancing on Gonzales to take their cannon. It was his paper that would print William Travis's letters from the Alamo, and it was his paper that would print the March 2nd, 1836 Texas Declaration of Independence. The Telegraph and Texas Register would go on to become the newspaper of record for Texas until the American Civil War. But being a customer of the Texas government during its bankrupt Republic years was not good for business. 2 years into running the newspaper, in 1837, with his bills to the Republic government almost entirely unpaid, Borden happily sold off the paper and turned back to surveying to pay his bills, and he hired on with the land company that was developing Galveston. Yet Borden couldn't escape his reputation for diligence and good clerical skills. The new Republic appointed him customs collector for the port of Galveston, which meant that Borden was responsible for collecting something like 1/3 of the Republic's entire revenues each year. All this while also getting elected to Galveston City Council and continuing to administer the sale of town lots that the Galveston City Company had entrusted him with. So it's not a surprise that when the well-known, ever-dynamic Borden went around inviting Galvestonians to a dinner party on that evening in 1847, people came. Borden started his dinner party by presenting his guests with a special culinary treat. Quote, "There are articles on this table from which, if you know what they were in their original condition, you would turn with loathing and horror. Out of the offal of the kitchens and the streets, I have created a food for the poor which will cost almost nothing." End quote. As you can see, Borden, at this point in his career anyway, didn't seem to have Samuel Colt's natural salesmanship. Because to be clear, what he was rather unappetizingly offering his guests was some kind of food paste made from animal byproducts. His guests politely sampled the pressed meat byproduct patties and did their best not to vomit. Then, Borden invited everyone back to the carriage house/workshop behind his house for the real entertainment. In the carriage house, he unveiled for them a contraption, which he proudly called his terraqueous machine. Terra for land, aqueous for water. It was basically an aquatic wagon with a square sail in the front that would allow it to be pushed along by the wind on land or on sea. If there's images of Dr. Emmett Brown coming into your head at this point, I'm seeing them too. But Borden's audience was clearly excited by it, because when he hitched up the wagon and towed his machine to the beach, a crowd followed along. As he unhitched the horses and pointed the stern toward the west, he asked for volunteers to climb aboard with him. A few brave souls answered the call. Once everyone was seated, Borden raised the sail, and to the delight of the riders of the terraqueous machine, it began to move. It was a marvelous sensation. No jolting, no loud engines, no odorous surprises from the back end of the horses pulling them. Were they parties to the maiden voyage of the next great transportation revolution? If the steamship had annihilated the distances between port cities, what might this new terraqueous machine do for overland distances? Might it connect the inland centers of commerce as seamlessly as the great river ports to the boundless commerce of the seas? Pretty soon, Borden's passengers were moving along at quite a respectable speed. Actually, the machine started to accelerate out of control. Faster and faster. A few of the riders squirmed. A few called for Borden to slow down. Up ahead, the beach veered north, but Borden, and the terraqueous machine he was piloting, did not. He crashed the machine straight into the surf at full speed, without warning, terrifying his passengers, who impulsively rushed to the landward side of the craft. Sit still, Borden screamed at them, indifferent to their terror, but concerned more about the machine's stability. Because for that brief moment, the terraqueous machine was working. The transition into the sea was rough, but now it was smooth sailing, so to speak. But his passengers still hadn't recovered from the shock. In their panic and in their moving around, they capsized Borden's machine. Luckily, they were still in shallow water, and so they were able to slog their way to shore. The same shore, perhaps, where Cabeza de Vaca had swept up 300 years before, I can't help but add. Once these 1847 castaways had reached dry land, they took a head count and realized that everyone was blessedly accounted for, everyone except for Gail Borden. They looked for him in the surf and realized he was still riding the capsized hull of his contraption out there in the bay. "Can you make it to shore?" somebody cried out to him. "I don't want to make it. It can't sink," he responded, and paused for an angry moment. Then he continued, "There was no danger. Why did you make such fools of yourself? Concern you," which was like the worst curse word that his Baptist mind could come up with. As you probably know, the terraqueous machine did not become an engine of Texas history. Yet Gail Borden, like Samuel Colt, was a relentless, if not a bit oblivious entrepreneur. He always told his friends, quote, "If I miss it in one thing, I will hit it in another," end quote. He was always working on a multitude of inventions. He was diversified back before that was a term that we thought about. And yet even his meat byproduct patties and his terraqueous machine shared something in common. They were attempts to harness uncaptured energy, either in the form of the calories contained in animal byproducts or in the gusts of wind that could move a ship across the land as easily as it could across the sea. And the industrial age was all about finding new ways to use and harness energy. But after these initial failures, Borden refined his thinking on the matter a little bit. He began to focus more on condensing energy than in harnessing it in different ways, which really is the same thing. As energy scholar Vaclav Smil says, energy is the universal currency. Energy is energy, whether captured from previously unharnessed sources, saved, or condensed from existing sources. Borden, of course, was not the first person to realize this. Indeed, anyone who had lived in the distant, arid expanses of Texas in pre-modern times had to appreciate this. Native American population densities in Texas were driven by proximity to energy sources, defined as good foraging or good buffalo hunting or lands good for raising corn. The horse, of course, redrew that map, but it didn't change the reality that anyone moving around the Texas plains needed to think very carefully about how to move their calories with them and how to do so as efficiently as possible. Even in colonial times, Tejanos' ongoing commercial struggle had been to try to find a way to get their agricultural bounty to distant markets without it perishing or costing so much that no one could buy it. They never quite succeeded, settling on non-perishable tallow and hides as the only goods that they could really export in any volume. But what if someone could find a way to get the rest of Texas's endless cattle herd to market? Beef sold for only 2 cents a pound in Texas, at the same time that it sold for at least 6 cents a pound on the East Coast. That's a 66% gross margin. If only someone could figure out how to get 2-cent perishable product to a 6-cent market. The economics of steamships helped, but you still had to transport the entire live animal, fully 2/3 of the weight of which wasn't really edible. And you had to transport feed to keep it alive, 2 to 3% of its body weight per day that you intended to transport it. Trail drives were another alternative, but the losses and risks for those, particularly before the railroad, were so high as to deter all but the most desperate. According to at least one biography of Gail Borden's life, a Comanche trader introduced Borden one day to a Comanche superfood, which the trader described as pinole. It consisted of, quote, powdered, pulverized, dried buffalo meat, dried, crushed hominy, and mesquite beans, end quote. Now, so-called pemmican recipes were common amongst the Plains Indians up and down the North American Great Plains. Pemmican was meat in fruit-based, however, typically made from the lean meat of large game animals like buffalo or deer, dried in the sun until about 5 portions of meat were reduced to 1 hard portion of jerky, then ground into a powder and mixed with dried berries and just the right amount of tallow to hold it together. It could then be reconstituted later on by adding back 5 portions of water to each portion of pemmican, or just eaten raw in some cases. But the interesting thing to me about this story is that the Comanche trader wasn't talking about pemmican. His recipe was for something a little different. Indeed, the fact that he calls it pinole is an interesting clue in this respect. Pinole doesn't refer to a meat-based product. It refers to a meal made from ground roasted corn, sometimes with mesquite beans and other flavorings mixed in. And yet the Comanche recipe wasn't truly pinole either, because it did have meat in it. Listen again, the Comanche superfood consisted of, quote, powdered, pulverized, dried buffalo meat, dried crushed hominy, corn, and mesquite beans, end quote. The Comanche recipe was a hybrid, as non-perishable as pemmican, and yet as energy-rich as pinole. This was essentially the recipe for Gail Borden's meat biscuit, as he called it, which he filed a patent for and identified the novelty of as deriving specifically from the mixing in of meat protein with carbohydrate-rich cereals, and then baking them to make them shelf-stable. In his words, quote, the nature of this discovery consists in preserving the concentrated nutritious properties of flesh meat of any kind, combining it with flour, and baking it into biscuits. 1 pound of this bread contains the extract of more than 5 pounds of the best meat, end quote. Note even that the ratio of 5-to-1 is preserved from the old Comanche recipe. By 1850, Borden had produced the first samples of his meat biscuit, which he submitted to the U.S. Army for trials. And the Army, by the way, had more foresight on this one than they'd had back with Colt's revolver. They loved the idea that a soldier could carry 2 months' rations on his back and have it weigh less than 20 pounds. Compared to the enormous livestock herds and stores of feed that previous expeditions onto the Great Plains had to carry, it was a revolution in logistics. The Army started buying meat biscuits, and Gail Borden went all in, mortgaging himself to the hilt to build out an enormous production line on Strand Street in Galveston. He even attended the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, where the judges awarded him a first-class medal over Colt's revolver, placing his invention on the same level as Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper and Charles Goodyear's vulcanized rubber. And yet, as the Great Exhibition wrapped up, some less than salutary reports started coming back from the U.S. Army's field trials. Borden's meat biscuit had proven to be more nutritionally complete in theory than in practice. Soldiers forced to live off the meat biscuit complained of, quote, headache, nausea, and great muscular depression, end quote. And it tasted terrible. More than one tester stated that they'd rather starve than eat one of Borden's meat biscuits, no matter how novel the idea was. The news reached Borden in London that the Army wouldn't be ordering any more of his meat biscuits. He was devastated, and he was financially ruined. Borden's voyage home from the Great Exhibition gave him plenty of time to reckon with the consequences of his failure. But he was still fixated on the possibilities of what he had unlocked with the meat biscuit. Quote, "I mean to put a potato in a pillbox, a pumpkin into a tablespoon, the biggest sort of watermelon into a saucer," end quote. And as these thoughts churned through his head, Borden suddenly realized that the milk cows on board his ship had gotten sick and stopped giving milk. And in the cries of the infants on board, Gail Borden heard opportunity calling him once again. He decided to deploy his condensifying genius to the production of condensed milk. Now, condensed milk wasn't a new idea, but simply boiling milk into a solid tended to strip it of all of its flavor. And also, this really only worked well with skim milk, which was pretty flavorless to begin with. No, Borden decided to condense whole milk and preserve its nutritional properties and flavor content while doing so. Borden's solution to the problems that had plagued previous innovators was to boil the whole milk in a vacuum. And this came from an intuition that he had. Quote, "Milk is a living fluid, like blood, and as soon as drawn from the cow, begins to die," end quote. And by the way, Borden's language here of milk as a living fluid, like blood, it calls to mind for me the old Comanche practice of mixing warm blood with milk from the udders of nursing buffalo heifers for a special treat after a buffalo hunt. But I don't have any reason to actually think that Borden was thinking that. Though I'll note here that once he had perfected his condensed milk process, the recipe for reconstituting it called once again for adding 5 parts water to just 1 part of the condensed milk product. Just like his meat biscuit recipe, and just like that old Comanche pinole recipe. This fixation on milk as a living fluid, and thus on the need to protect that fluid from all outside contaminants, became the guiding principle of Borden's process. All of his milk cows had their udders washed thoroughly in warm water before milking, and milking barns were required to be swept clean and manure carried away twice a day. The milk was required to be kept at 58 degrees or below all the way to the factory, where the cans of milk were placed into a vat of water, raised to 190 degrees, and then lifted into a separate vat and heated once more, where the vacuum would suck the milk into a pan whose temperature never exceeded 136 degrees. It was condensed there to 25% of its original volume and placed in a vat of ice to cool, then loaded onto rail cars with ice again and delivered at a temperature that, once again, never exceeded 58 degrees. It was a level of industrial precision that I'm not sure had ever been applied to food production before. And recall, too, this is a decade before the discoveries of pasteurization and the germ theory of disease and the subsequent emphasis on sanitation as a key component of public health. Condensed milk, as you might suspect, was particularly attractive to city dwellers who didn't have access to their own milk cows. For this reason, Borden moved to Brooklyn, New York in 1858, the most urbanized part of the continent, and he launched his Eagle brand condensed milk. Things were going well enough that in 1861, Gail Borden completed a planned plant expansion, and this so happened to be just in time to supply one of the largest armies that the world had ever seen. In 1862, he sold the U.S. Army something like 300 quarts of milk per day. By 1863, he was selling something like 15,000 quarts per day. And when the war was over, demand didn't falter. Returning soldiers had acquired a taste for condensed milk. In 1871, Borden sold 165,000 quarts per day. Condensed milk was among the first and most successful innovations in processed food. Americans have a complicated relationship with processed food today, but that's only because it has become so good at condensing and cheaply transporting caloric energy that it's overwhelmed our body and our mind's ability to measure its consumption. But from the standpoint of farmers and ranchers, which is what most Texans were well into the 20th century, processed food helped level the price differentials between producers and consumers, passing more of that back to producers in large part. Because it removed the costs of perishability. It helped eliminate the disadvantages of distance under which Texas agriculture had labored for so long. Gail Borden died back in Texas in 1874, but he was always a bit unappreciated in his home state I think because of his Union loyalties and for his later donations in support of freedmen's schools and black churches. And so his body was returned for final burial to New York City, where his gravestone today, though, carries perhaps the most beautifully Texan epigraph that I can imagine. Quote, "I tried and failed. I tried again and again and succeeded." End quote. There's a recurring pattern that we've already seen and will continue to see of Texans innovating around the disadvantages of distance by finding ways to concentrate diffuse energy and to make things denser and thus more portable. And there's no better example of an engine of history that would do more to annihilate the disadvantages of distance than the railroad. On the next episode of The Engines of Texanity. Thank you for listening. For this episode, I relied quite a bit on an old biography of Gail Borden by a UT professor named Joe France. It's called Gail Borden, Dairyman to a Nation. Also, the cover art for this episode was designed by David Moore for a Texas Co-op Power article a couple years ago. You can check out more of his work at illustrationonline.com. This season is brought to you by the 11th Street River House in Bandera, Texas. Sort of. My wife and I have dreamed for years about owning a place in Bandera, and we finally bought a house there last year. 4 blocks from the bars, 3 blocks from the Frontier Times Museum, with 120 feet of Medina River frontage and a collection of historic Texas maps on the wall, curated by yours truly. It's a great place to spend a weekend and to sort of indirectly support this podcast. Look it up under 11th Street River House on Airbnb or on VRBO. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco. Sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. Stephen Bennett also composed and performed the theme music. You can find more about Stephen at info@nosomedia, nosomedia.com. David Moore designed the cover art for this season. You can find him at illustrationonline.com. For more information on our sources and other projects, please check out www.brandonseal.com.